The van door thudded shut like a coffin lid. Ozzy pressed his palms to the cold metal as the engine rumbled. He smelled diesel and disinfectant, and, beneath it all, something older. The sweet, sour tang of old cell blocks and moth-eaten blankets. In his head the hum of the engine folded into the thrum of his own heartbeat, and every so often a fragment of a tune would bob to the surface. A riff, a rumble of drums, a half-remembered lyric that smelled like smoke and rain. Black Hollow sat in a bowl of land, the way a bruise sits under skin. On paper it had been decommissioned when the old warden died and the budget ran out, but the sign still read, "Prison," and the gate still had a padlock with teeth like a mouth. Folk in the town avoided it. Kids dared one another to touch the railing. Old-timers left coins on the crumbling steps and muttered apologies under their breath. To them it was a place that kept secrets, and to secrets, Ozzy thought with a crooked smile, you could bring a tune, and it would hum along. He was brought in under a weird mandate, something about documentary crews and contrived publicity, about an experience that would sell to streaming platforms and crank up ratings. But behind the cameras and the contract clauses was something else, an old rumor, hand-me-down from guard to family to rumor-monger, that the penitentiary wasn't finished with anyone. That sometimes, when the moon threw itself across the yard, the building remembered. Ozzy had long since stopped pretending he wasn't terrified of more than just microphones. Fear had been a companion for years, fear of missing notes, fear of losing time, of waking up in rooms he didn't remember moving through. Yet on the way into Black Hollow, with the iron gate yawning and the night air tasting like pennies, he felt a thrill he hadn't felt in decades. The sick, lucid excitement of a man who'd spent his life courting danger and had finally found a darkness that might sing back. They put him in cell 13, a square of air and light roughly the size of a closet. The bunk was a mattress that had held other backs and other dreams, and the pillow smelled faintly of lavender and something else, talc maybe, or the ghost of a mother's hand. A single narrow window cut a strip of moon through the far wall. The door clanged shut, sealing Ozzy in with his imaginings. The first night there was only the house sound of old prisons, the drip of water, the settling of metal, a shiver in the walls as if the building were stretching its limbs. He lay awake listening, making a list of noises like a man trying to remember an old tune by ear. Somewhere, a door banged. Somewhere else someone laughed and then stopped, as if discovering their own breath was audible. Every noise folded into something that sounded, at a certain pitch and angle of hearing, like a chorus. By the third night, the chorus had names. They were subtle at first, a whisper like someone pushing through curtains, a syllable, a word. He would blink, and there would be nothing. He started to talk back to the voices out of habit. Years on the road teach you to address the audience, even when it's imaginary. "All right then," he whispered into the dark. "If you're gonna sing, sing proper." The voices responded with a scrape under the door and the rustle of papers. It could have been the wind. It could have been pigeons nesting in some forgotten shaft. Or, and this is where the little hairs along a man's arms insist on being remembered, it could have been something that had been there before him, something that heard music in the bones of things and wanted to sing. One evening, a thin blue light pooled at the foot of his bunk, and the shape of a man rose up from it like smoke. He didn't quite remember breathing. The figure had no face, only the suggestion of one, an arrangement of shadow and a pair of hollow eyes. It wore, or rather the outline suggested it wore, an old uniform stained by time. It did not walk. It hummed, a low vibration that set his fillings jangling. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, and the voice wasn't a voice so much as a radio catching a station between frequencies. It pulled from him a memory, an image of Ozzy as a small boy, head full of noise, face pressed to a radio as if communion might occur if he pressed it hard enough. "Neither should you," Ozzy said, because that was the sort of thing you said to a ghost. He was suddenly very aware of his hands, how they shook when he rolled a cigarette between his fingers. The figure tilted his head. In the space between words, the prison released a sound like 1,000 doors breathing. "This place takes a toll," it said, "gives back what it can. Sometimes songs, sometimes more." Ozzy laughed, a short, nervous bark. He had a lifetime of tall tales to draw on. "Tell me then, what have you got for me?" What it gave him was a corridor that wasn't there the next morning. He woke to find the cell door slightly ajar, and the corridor beyond lengthened like a perspective trick. Tiles that had been scrubbed raw extended into darkness where they shouldn't have been. He stepped out, and the lights Nolam squelched like a mouthful of rain. The overhead lamps leaked yellow, and the shadows pooled into the corners like little conspirators. Down the hall, a jukebox sat in a niche. He had sworn there had been no jukebox. The wing had been stripped years ago. And yet there it was, chrome flaking, a stack of faded LP sleeves behind glass. He touched it, and felt the hum of amp and speaker under his palm, as if an instrument waited in the wood. He fed it a coin he didn't remember pulling from his pocket, and the needle dropped onto a groove. The song that poured out wasn't any song he'd played, but it tasted like him, vague riffs, someone counting in the blue. And when the chorus hit, Ozzy felt his teeth ache with recognition. The music made the corridor breathe in time, and then the walls opened like a mouth to reveal a side room where other figures gathered. They were prisoners of different ages and eras. There was a man with a mustache and a typewriter, the smear of ink on his sleeve telling stories he could no longer remember. A woman wrapped in a shawl whose hands fluttered like moths. A child with one shoe who looked at him as if he'd arrived for the first time. They were not all dead. Some of them wore the paler pallor of the living who had been forgotten. Some were doorless, face suggestions like wax, but their eyes were bright and weary, and they listened to him the way an audience listens the first time a new light is struck. "You carry with you a bell," said the child, solemn as a parish priest. "It rings, and the walls answer." Ozzy's laugh came out small. "Bell? If I had a bell, kid, I'd ring it at every show." "Ring here," said the woman in the shawl. "You might get something back." That's the shape of a bargain most haunted places make. The promise that if you give up something, your sleep, your breath, your recollection, the building will cough up another thing in return. Sometimes it is a secret, a confession, a note. Sometimes it is a memory that isn't yours. Ozzy leaned into it. Rock and roll had taught him the currency of exchange was often tongue and throat, and the beating of a heart. He started to talk, to sing into the walls. He told tales of stages and empty hotels, of the time a microphone cord saved him from falling, of the smell of green rooms. The ghosts listened, and, as they listened, they shifted. In the days that blurring of time was the prison's favorite trick. Morning and evening traded places like magicians switching hats. The staff, when present, were echoes of themselves, crew members from Ozzy's past visiting in different uniforms. A guard who'd once worked the night shift at a stadium checked his watch and nodded as if he'd been waiting for an encore. A cafeteria worker who might have served him tea decades ago offered a plate of stew that tasted like a lyric. Everything was familiar and wrong, like a harmony sung off-key. Ozzy found notes tucked into the seam of the mattress, scribbles of names he recognized and names he didn't, chord progressions half-formed, scrawled in a tiny hand. He would unfold them at odd hours and try to pull some shape from them. Sometimes they were perfect, a line that made his scalp prickle with the quiet intelligence of truth. Sometimes they were cruel and petty, insults whispered by someone who had once been his friend or a lover, reshaped by the night into barbs. But the clearest voice he heard was the one that called him by the thing he had been called on stage for years, the Prince of Darkness, the man who'd clambered up speakers and spat out songs and swallowed the lights whole. The prison liked stories and metaphors. It liked to dramatize. It put before him scenes that were theatrical because Ozzy had always been theatrical. He would pass a cell, and inside, stretched across a bunk, propping a leg on a radiator, would be a version of himself from some past show. Blood-slick eyeliner, a feathered suit, hair like a thundercloud. They didn't speak. They merely performed, rehearsing lines that Ozzy had never said, but had once been expected to say. One night, during a storm that battered the panes and tuned the gutters into strings, he wandered into the chapel. It was a place where the architecture seemed to fold prayer into its mortar. The pews were thick with dust, and old hymn books lay face down, their pages salted with the residue of tears. He sat and pressed his palms to the wood. The building hummed through him then, as if inviting confession. "Why me?" he asked aloud, not sure if he meant the warden or the corridor or life itself. "Why give me all this?" From the shadows a man came forward, the warden or some facsimile of him, though he had the body of a boy and the face of a thing made of mirrors. He smelled of bleach and rain. "Because places remember what people leave behind," the warden said. "Because you have a particular kind of noise. You can wake what is sleeping." There was a kind of justice to the prison's choice. Ozzy, who had made a career out of the grotesque and the glamorous, had always been able to take what was left at the bottom of a barrel and make it sing. When he told the chorus its story, it would in turn tell him something. This was the prison's deal, a trade that would perhaps unsettle him, perhaps heal him, perhaps break him. It was not a place of simple malice. It was an instrument whose strings had been tuned by suffering and loneliness. So he began to sing. Not stage songs, not rehearsed choruses. These were low laments and groan, thick with an ache that wasn't entirely his. He sang in the chapel while the storm hammered and the rain stitched itself to the rafters. The voice that came through him was ragged and human, and when he opened his mouth the walls wept. Cells answered with tapping, and the radiator shuddered like a percussion instrument. Down the hall, someone thumped a metal tray like a cymbal. The warden turned his head and wept, though his face offered no explanation why. What happened after that unfolded as a litany of small hauntings braided together into one long, dreadful line. In his sleep he walked the yard and saw shapes moving in the grass. Not animals, not guards, but the impressions of events that had taken place there. A pair of shoes left in a hurry, an abandoned letter, a child's toy half buried. He unearthed them as if they were fossils, and in the garage he found names. Each name told a story. One belonged to a woman who had come with a basket of bread and never been seen again. Another to a prisoner who'd carved his initials into a window sill and then vanished at dusk. The stories were not always neat. Some ended in tragedy, some ended in a comfort that made his throat ache. Some seemed to loop forever, replaying the moment of a quarrel until the heat cooled and the edges blurred. Ozzy found himself reading them aloud, one after another, as if by speaking them he could excise something from the building. The prison, greedy as ever, did not respond with gratitude. It responded with tests. On a gray afternoon the lights went out. It was the kind of blackout city people speak of in legends, the kind that turns faces to masks and makes time leak. In the sudden dark, his cigarette glowed like a single planet. He stood, cupped the ember between his palms, and felt a presence descend like a blanket. There were footsteps in the corridor, and then a slow, deliberate tapping on the slab above the cell. "You're not leaving," someone said, the voice pressed up against the concrete. Not yet. He thought of bargains and notes and the coin that had mysteriously found the jukebox. He thought of the faces in the chapel and the names he'd read. He thought of the child who had told him he carried a bell. The tapping quickened and became an actual rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. A heartbeat doubled. Somewhere, a guitar riff materialized from the dark, and the pattern dovetailed into a melody he'd never heard and yet knew intimately. Music in this place was a language you could trade with. He told the tapping to stop, and it did not. He told it to tell him the name of whoever was inside the wall, and it said, "Then sing." So he sang. He sang as if the words could pull a name from the stone. He sang as if the chorus of souls had been an audience waiting a lifetime. The song spun and folded, time collapsing and stretching like a trombone. The tapping slowed and then, like a faucet breaking, loosened into an old writer's whisper. A single name. It wasn't his name, and it wasn't the name he'd expected. It fell into the cell like a coin. He wrote it down on a scrap of paper. The letters trembled as if cold. He folded the paper and slid it under the mattress. That night, in the small hours, he dreamed the figure who had been locked inside the wall stepping out, rubbing the place where they'd been held, and laughing a laugh that tasted of release. Soup cooled on a tray. Somewhere, a man found the courage to pen the letter he'd kept back for decades. The prison was not all metaphor and music. There were moments of cruelty that required fortitude to endure. Once, for reasons he couldn't fathom, his record collection disappeared. Weeks of catalogued warmth, plucked from the crate like plucked petals. He prowled the facility with a lantern that made his breath pool in the light. In the laundry room he found one vinyl half melted into the drum, the grooves running like rivers. In the library, an LP sleeve hung from a shelf like a face on the wall. He learned to stop trying to possess the intangible and instead become a steward for it. The crew filming the documentary found their equipment sabotaged in ways that defied suspicion. Lenses clouded with frost on a warm day, footage that rewound itself to show the same frame in which a child's hand waved from the window, recordings playing whispers that decoded into a map of the penitentiary's hidden rooms. When they argued and traded accusations, the prison murmured back with an echo of their own voices, making them feel as if each argument had been rehearsed long before and would be rehearsed forever. It was amid this uneasy balancing act that Ozzy met the man known only as the archivist. The archivist lived in the basement, if living in a place of paper and ink can be called living. He was a thin man with glassine skin and eyes like two burned-out bulbs. He catalogued things the way a priest catalogues sins, neat, meticulous, unblinking. His hands were stained with the color of old photographs. When Ozzy first stumbled upon him, he was flipping through a ledger as if it were a Bible. "You sing well," the archivist said. "You wake corners of the place that have been sleeping." "Oh, thanks," Ozzy said, ducking a grin. "Do I get royalties?" "No," the archivist said, "but you get to read." He handed Ozzy a file, and the cover crackled like a dry leaf. Inside were photographs, faces of prisoners and guards, page after page. Some were smiling on their release day, some were captured in the act of being human, with all the defects and stature of people trying to navigate hunger and fear. Ozzy ran his finger along the seam of one, and where he touched the ink shimmered, and a small voice began to speak from its margins. "History," said the archivist, "isn't always the comfortable version. It is a ledger of things we refuse to tuck away." Ozzy started reading them aloud. He found joy and horror and the kind of melancholy that made his throat tighten. There were stories of men who'd saved each other in flashes of bravery and petty cruelties that lasted like a stain. He read the names into the night, and the walls listened. The archivist nodded like a man taking attendance. "You hear the building," he said finally, "and it hears you. That is why it brought you." "Why me?" Ozzy asked again, because it was a question that persisted, a child thumping its spoon against a bowl for attention. The archivist's smile was a slow closing of a book. "Because you remember to make a noise out of the chaos." The notion that making noise could be a moral act settled in Ozzy like a warm shawl. He'd always believed in noise, the way it could cut through the blankness and make people stand up and move. But here the noise sounded like a responsibility. If the prison collected names and stories, then perhaps they needed to be set free by song. Perhaps the only way to release them from repetition was to make them permanent in a voice. And so he did. He traversed the penitentiary in search of names. He sat in the yard and improvised laments that the wind carried into the barbed wire. He crouched by the furnace and made melodies that soothed the iron and coaxed the ashes into stories. He sat on a radiator, and hummed a tune that used to open his shows and watched as shadows gathered like a congregation. He stitched the photographs from the archivist into a new set list, each song a dedication, each chorus a liberation. The hauntings, to the untrained eye, might be called a miracle. The dead found a rhythm, and the living found reprieve. The pigeon that had once nested behind the chapel door returned bearing a scrap of cloth. In it, a name. The hush in the laundry room became a lullaby. The guard who had once slammed the iron gate shut for a prisoner who never woke up wept openly at a piano. He said a confession he had carried in his pockets for 40 years, a small truth about mercy denied. The walls exhaled a relief that unsettled the mortar. But above all, Black Hollow was hungry for closure. It had been built to hold people, and it prospered on their incompletions. Bring it an ending, and it would grumble with contentment. Ozzy found endings are not always grand. They are often small, domestic, and terribly human. He pieced them out, stitch by stitch. On the last night of his stay, or what felt like the last night, time here drew its own maps. The penitentiary held a séance of sorts. The entire wing pooled into the chapel. The archivist, the child in one shoe, the woman with moth hands, a handful of frightened crew members, and the spectral forms that preferred corners. Above them, the chandelier swung like a pendulum counting down. They formed a circle, and Ozzy stood in the middle, guitar balanced on his knee, though most nights of his earlier career he'd been the sort to throw his guitar and let the world catch the sound. He began with a low hum, building a key from the marrow of the building. Then he sang each name he'd found. The woman with the bread, the prisoner who had carved initials, the guards who had loved too hard and mourned too little. Each name landed like a seed. When he reached the last, the smallest name, almost a whisper, the chapel gave a sound like 1,000 tiny doors closing at once. A draft swept through and blew out every candle. In the instant of darkness, he felt something touch his shoulder, something neither cold nor warm, but anciently alive. A hand, perhaps, or the idea of a hand. When the light returned, the faces in the circle looked clearer, as if someone had wiped the fog from their eyes. "Thank you," the child said. It was not exactly human gratitude, not a spoken courtesy, but something larger. The kind of indebtedness that is a tidy final thing and very hard to come by. The prison, which had fed on half-told stories for decades, had finally had a meal that satisfied. He left soon after. The van that returned him to the gate smelled of diesel and rain. The padlock hung on the gate like a relic. The crew packed up their gear and argued about footage and rights. The archivist stayed behind, smiling into the ledger and adding a note perhaps. Ozzy walked away carrying a handful of songs he hadn't known he had. They scratched at his skin like burrs. He had no idea whether the music had been given freely or whether he had paid in a coin from deeper in his pocket. A memory, an hour, a sleep. He thought of the way the building had listened and remembered his lines and wondered about the cost of that service. When he returned to civilization, the world seemed brighter and paler and more complicated than before. Fans asked about his eyes, why they glittered with some new intensity, and he told them it had been an experience, an experiment, a thing he had done for art. He didn't mention the child or the archivist or the jukebox. Who would believe him? Who would want to believe that a building could be fed music and in return cough up the ghosts of small human injustices? Yet sometimes, when the house was quiet and the moon laid a thin silver seam across his floor, he would hum a tune from memory, a quiet, secret melody like paper folding into a secret pocket. And sometimes, on nights when the world felt ready, something would answer from beyond the walls. A tapping on a window that sounded like applause, faint and hesitant. A light that flickered in time with his heartbeat. He would smile and let the sound wash over him, and every so often he would add a name to a song, because memory is greedy, and generosity is sometimes the same thing as obligation. He learned in the aftermath that hauntings were not always terrifying. They could be a plea, a reminder. They could be the way a building asked to be known for what it had swallowed. Black Hollow returned to being a rumor and a silhouette on the horizon. People forgot to leave coins on its steps. The kids found new dares. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world held its breath and the night's thin skin pulled tight, Ozzy would sometimes press his ear to the raw wood of his guitar and hear, for a heartbeat or two, the chapel and its ghosts singing back. And if he ever felt the need to go back, it was not because he believed in ghosts more than men. It was because somewhere in that corridor of memory and brick, someone had asked for an ending. Someone had been waiting for a tune to set them free. And Ozzy, who'd spent a lifetime turning noise into law, was good at keeping promises.